Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am joined by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nate the Great Jahnke. We are live once again on the YouTubes and out into the Twitterverse. Week 7 is in the books, Nate, and now we head into Week 8, where we don't have a single team on a bye week. Injuries are running rampant all across the NFL. It's a damn jungle out there. So how are you managing in these trying times?
Doing fine. We had the doubleheader on Monday Night Football, was still able to get at least some sleep. It always seems to be the case when they have that doubleheader on Monday Night Football where they offset it by 45 minutes that the first game goes a little long, the second game goes a little quickly, so then they end like within 15 minutes of each other, which happened again last night, which makes it a bit of a nightmare when I'm writing the recap articles, but we got it out. We got it out quickly enough after the games, and it was interesting games last night.
Yeah, interesting to say the least. It was nice to see that Baltimore and Tampa Bay offenses working well, other than, Tampa Bay losing their two top wide receivers. And then, the Chargers-Arizona game was a game that happened. So we'll talk about players from all of those games as we go through here. And feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go. We'll try to get to them as we go through the list here. You can also reference Nate's waiver wire article on PFF.com, and you could get access to that with a PFF Plus subscription, along with the very many tools and resources of PFF.com. So get in there, check that out. And we're going to start right away with the running backs, Nate. And starting at the top of the list this week, just squeaking his way under that 50% rostership threshold is Tyrone Tracy, who didn't necessarily have like a big game on the stat sheet, but there was at least some notable usage from him with Devin Singletary returning to the lineup, Nate.
First off, interesting week for running backs. There's not as much depth as there has been the last couple weeks, so a lot of this is a bit more dependent on your league. Hopefully anyone who's listened to us the last couple weeks already knows Tyrone Tracy should have already bet on your roster, but there is at least 50% of leagues where he's available. So Tracy did play over 50% of the snaps with Devin Singletary back, which was really good to see. Singletary, there was a chance that he was still a little bit limited, maybe a chance Singletary starts to see a little bit more playing time, but Tracy still outplayed Singletary in this game. Neither running back was all that successful in terms of box score stats just because they were blown out by the Philadelphia Eagles. So not a great game for the running backs, but looking at the schedule going forward, it does get a lot easier. So even in my 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high, I included Tracy as someone that you want to be trading for, even if he is on a roster right now, just because that schedule is so nice. And after that game where he didn't put up very many numbers, I think he's someone who can be a pretty decent fantasy starter over this next month or so.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on for next week, right? Because, there's a chance that they were easing Singletary back in coming off injuries. But if we get the same kind of usage next week, then we could start to, accept Tyrone Tracy as a potential RB1 there in New York. So let's go on to actually kind of a very similar situation in Las Vegas with their backfield, because we've been seeing Alexander Mattison work as the primary running back with Zamir White injured, but Zamir White returned this week, and that didn't really change Mattison's status as the top dog in that backfield, at least for now. So what do we see there from the Raiders?
White only ran 3 times for 13 yards. If anyone, it was Amir Abdullah who was taking more snaps from Mattison away on passing downs and Mattison losing snaps on early downs. So that was good to see. And this was a pretty close game between them and the Rams. So the Raiders didn't have to abandon the run quite as quickly as they have in most games so far this season. So Mattison was able to run 23 times for 92 yards, which was really good to see. Still not sure Mattison is someone that I want to be starting most weeks. It'll probably depend a lot on the opponent and how much we think the Raiders can stay close in the game, because that'll have a huge factor in how much Mattison's getting the ball. And like you said, there's a chance that White, once he is closer to 100%, could see more of the carries, but Mattison did play decently well, averaged 4 yards per carry, which isn't great, but is a bit better than what we've seen out of the Raiders backfield so far this season.
Yeah. So, like you said, I mean, we got a lot of options here in week 8 because there won't be bye weeks. There'll still be plenty of rosters that may have to rely on Alexander Mattison. But we'll be getting some starting running backs back, hopefully. One of those running backs maybe is Jonathan Taylor. He's now missed 3 games in a row with that high ankle sprain, but there's a chance he'll be back in week 8, but certainly not a guarantee. So we got more of the Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson show in Indianapolis. Sermon is over that 50% rostership mark now, though Goodson sits at just 9%. So what did the usage look like in Indianapolis this week, Nate?
In terms of their playing time, it was a pretty even split across the board. So that was interesting to see. They didn't really have a preference towards anyone being a third down back or early down back, even though in the past we had seen Sermon play a little bit more on early downs, Goodson more on late downs. But Goodson had been playing better as a runner over those last 2 games. So Goodson got the ball more often when he was on the field, ran 14 times for 51 yards and a touchdown. Sermon only ran 8 times. So there is definitely a chance that Jonathan Taylor is going to be back this week. It sounds like he's going to at least be practicing on a limited basis. So there's no guarantee that Goodson will have any fantasy value going forward. But in the chance that Jonathan Taylor does miss a game, Goodson is the clear player who has at least a chance of being a fantasy starter this upcoming week, who's available in at least 60% of ESPN leagues.
Yep, I think that makes sense. Okay, so next man up is one of the running backs who got on John Gruden's Feeling Nicey video, Ray Davis. He did it on Monday Night Football. Now, this was the situation where James Cook was out and Ray Davis went off in week 6, but Cook returned to the lineup this week. So did Ray Davis earn himself an increase in usage with Cook back in the lineup, Nate?
It was a slight increase in usage compared to what we've seen. It's why I like the pie graphs that we have for the running backs, because we can see the differences over time and kind of separate out how the game script can influence things, since a lot of the pie graph does look fairly similar for the Bills to what it has been in the past. Ty Johnson has been the third down back for most of the season. Things have been pretty split on goal line and short yardage, but we did see James Cook take a lower percentage of the early down snaps. And then on top of that, we saw Ray Davis average more yards per carry. Davis did score a touchdown in this game. So Davis continued to look good when he was given opportunities. So I would not be surprised if this gets at least closer to a 50-50 split on early downs. I don't know if it'll get fully to 50-50, but something that's noteworthy about this backfield compared to a lot of others is the Bills will hopefully be winning a number of games this season, in which case we could see both running backs get a number of opportunities in the backfield. So even if Davis doesn't fully take over, if he doesn't become the number 1 guy, there is still a chance where he can score enough points to be a fantasy starter in some weeks over the rest of the season.
Nice. I like it. Okay, and then making his season debut for the New Orleans Saints on Thursday Night Football this past week, Kendre Miller of the New Orleans Saints, Nate, and he actually led the Saints in rushing in week 7 with 36 whole yards. So what did the usage look like to get him on the waiver wire list this week?
Yeah, this I think is where we get to a clear point where last week was very different than this week. When we were at this point last week, we were going through half the players who could be starters for this past week, and now it's players who maybe have a chance of becoming relevant at some point this season. And so, like you said, Miller ended up leading the team in rushing yards, but he was used on the second drive of the game, which was good to see, and his return get used for a couple of snaps on that second drive. So good to see him get used early in the game. A lot of his work came late in the game in the fourth quarter. I think the big thing for me is Jamal Williams, even last week, wasn't used very much. They were using other running back who wasn't active in this game as the second running back. So it seems pretty clear to me that Miller will probably be at least the number 2 running back going forward, even though I expect all 3 players to get snaps. Don't know if we get a point where he overtakes Alvin Kamara or anything like that. So it would probably take a Kamara injury, or there's at least a chance that Kamara gets traded. I know Kamara's been pretty public that he does not want to get traded, but the Saints are at a point where their record isn't great with all the injuries they've had on offense and defense. There's a chance they decide to start looking more towards the future, in which case Kamara might not be part of that future, considering his cap number and his age. So there's at least a chance he gets traded, and also a chance that they just want to see what they have in Miller for next year so they can plan ahead for 2025. So there is also a chance that even if Miller doesn't overtake the backfield, he could still see significant work just so the Saints know what they have in Miller for 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, no, I think that would make sense. For them, at least. I mean, yeah, like you said, they're banged up like crazy right now. All kinds of injuries there. So, yeah, if Derek Carr doesn't get back soon, they could be again just continuing to slide here down the standings. But speaking of injuries, a player that was questionable coming into Monday Night Football, Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals, who yeah, he did play in this game, but didn't have any carries in week 7. But was also dealing with some kind of illness heading into that game as well. So maybe something that contributed there. But we're still considering Benson a handcuff addition here, Nate.
Oh yeah, just same thing that's been true since the offseason. We know James Conner has been more likely to get hurt than most running backs. Hasn't happened so far this season, but there is a chance that it does happen, in which case Benson would get the role that James Conner has, and Conner had a fairly good game last night, so would see Benson jumping right into that role if that happens at some point this season.
Yeah. Yep, I'm with you. And then actually another Monday Night Football player is up next, Kamani Vidal, or as Nick was referring to him on the preview show, King Monty Vidal. King Monty was pretty quiet in a close game this week, just 3 carries for 10 yards and 1 catch for 9 yards, but at least seems to be operating as the primary backup for the Chargers right now, Nick.
Oh yeah, was the clear backup, and he did play a higher percentage of the snaps this week compared to last week. A lot of that had to do with the 2-minute drill. At the end of the first half, he played 8 consecutive snaps, all at the end of the half. So at halftime, it was a pretty near even split in terms of offensive snaps. Dobbins pulled ahead in the second half, but it was another week where Vidal had more yards per carry, so at least a chance he starts seeing more playing time going forward. And similar to the Arizona Cardinals situation, J.K. Dobbins has an extensive injury history, so probably a little bit more chance that Dobbins gets injured than the average running back. So that's why Vidal is here.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. So then next up is a running back who did not play on Monday, but did play on Sunday alongside his partners in the Miami Dolphins backfield, both Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane, that is. Jalen Wright is our name here. We got to see how kind of all 3 of these guys work together for, I guess, the first time since week 1. So what did the Miami usage look like in week 7?
Yeah, and even week 1, Wright was inactive, so it was our first time seeing all 3 of these guys playing from the start of the game to the end. Wright was the clear number 3 back on the team, which wasn't great to see if you're hoping for Wright to have a bigger role. But whenever he was on the field, he was often getting the ball, ran the ball 5 times for 33 yards. Good to see him average 6.6 yards per carry. Had the highest rushing average of the 3 running backs. So I think, considering he has played so well when he's on the field, there should be a chance that he earns more playing time going forward. All 3 running backs looked at least decently good this week, but if Wright continues to play better than the other running backs, then you would think he would start to earn more playing time. And in the past years, the Dolphins backfield has been pretty fluid in terms of who's the starter and who's the backup, just depending on who's playing best at the time. So I don't think the Dolphins coaching staff will be as stubborn as some other coaching staffs when you see a backup running back who's consistently playing better than a starter.
Yeah, and it'll help if the offense gets better as well, right? Tua's expected back this week, so hopefully they start to operate a little bit better, maybe get into some more favorable situations for the running backs, and yeah, maybe Wright could get some more value for us there. But back to the Monday Night Football participants. Actually, and another guy that was on the John Gruden Nicey video. Have you seen these Nicey videos, Nate?
I have not, no.
Oh, okay, you got to watch them. They're amazing. But until that, I'll stop referencing them because they're one of my favorite things of the season so far. But it's Sean Tucker of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We got the hot hand talk coming into this week from Todd Bowles, talking about his running back room and who he was going to go with. But is that kind of what we saw from the Tampa Bay running backs this week?
Yeah, we did. Or we at least saw all 3 running backs get used. I don't think they really had a chance to go to the hot hand because they fell behind by halftime, so they had to go with their receiving back. But we saw all 3 running backs get snaps on the first drive of the game, so it was clear that all 3 were going to be involved. And then in the first half of the game, all the players had 5 carries. Tucker did look the best out of the 3 running backs in terms of running the ball. It had the highest yards per carry among the running backs, but it was a situation where they were down 17-10 at halftime, and then the Ravens kept scoring and scoring in the third quarter. So they did pretty quickly go back to just being having their receiving back on the field, which is White, and then Irving mixed in a little bit throughout the second quarter, but it was a lot of White, just depending on the game script. I would expect the Buccaneers to be able to keep using all 3 running backs a little bit more going forward, and ideally someone is able to get more of a hot hand and it gets down to a 2-man backfield rather than a 3-man backfield, or even a 1-man backfield if we're really wishfully thinking. But until that point, I think all 3 running backs should at least be on rosters just to see how this backfield shakes out, but it would be hard to start any of them until this stops being a clear 3-man rotation.
Yeah, it's an annoying thing to have to deal with for sure for fantasy purposes. I know I have a few leagues where I have Rashad White and Bucky Irving, and I just didn't start either of them last week because they were facing the Ravens, who are a very good defense against running backs, and that didn't work out necessarily. But there will be other weeks to correct that. And then lastly, we got our 2 usual stashes at the running back position here. Nate, Clyde Edwards-Helaire of the Kansas City Chiefs and Keaton Mitchell of the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, neither of these guys played in week 7, but anything changed for their outlook in your opinion?
Only thing with Edwards-Helaire, he was eligible to return this week. He was inactive, but he did return to the 53-man roster. Nate Taylor of The Athletic did say he's projected to be available next week. So I think next week is when we'll see how the backfield could shake out with all the running backs. Would not be surprised if Edwards-Helaire is limited in his first game back, so I wouldn't just drop him if you picked him up just to see what doesn't happen or does or doesn't happen with him. But I could see him over the next couple games get more involved.
Yep, makes sense. All right, quick ad break before we get into our wide receivers here, and it's from DraftKings Pick 6. The best part of the football season, checking out the post-game stats. Which wideouts scored more than 2 touchdowns? Which quarterbacks threw for less than 350 yards? Think you can pick who will do what before kickoff? Then play Pick 6 from DraftKings, an official daily fantasy partner of the NFL. Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app, select between 2 and 6 players, and choose if they'll have more or less of a stat. It's that simple. And for all first-time Pick 6 players, check this out. New customers play $5 on your first pick set. Get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Download the new DraftKings Pick 6 app now and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers to play $5 on your first pick set. Get $50 in Pick 6 credits only on DraftKings Pick 6. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility varies by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits expire in 6 months. Limited time offer. See terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos. All right, let's go to the wide receivers now. And leading this group this week was the man that led the Packers in receiving in week 7. It's Romeo Doubs, Nate. Doubs has been on this list before because he's been leading the Green Bay wide receivers in route runs. And that usage is starting to kind of materialize into fantasy points over the past couple of weeks. Scored 2 touchdowns last week. Now leads the team in led the team in targets with 10 targets, 8 receptions, and 94 receiving yards this past week. Rostered in just 37% of ESPN leagues. So have to imagine that'll be going up this week.
Yeah, he's been the top 5 wide receiver over the past 2 weeks, scored the 2 touchdowns a week ago as well. This was the first game in a while that we've seen all of the Packers wide receivers at least ready to play for the full game from start to end. And it was the usual rotation that we've seen all season long. Doubs has been one of the outside receivers. It's been the other 2 rotating as the other outside spot. And then Jaden Reed just playing in the slot in 3 receiver sets. So Doubs, it's been great to see him get the targets after not quite seeing as many targets early in the season. And the Packers offense has been playing well, even when they played against some great opponents. So good to see Doubs playing well, regardless of who he's playing. And the Packers have a pretty decent schedule for wide receivers going forward. A lot of good matchups over these next 9 to 10 weeks. So even though there are some pretty good wide receiver options on the waiver wire this week, probably the deepest it's been, at least in comparison to running backs for most of the season. But it was really the schedule over these next 8 or 9 weeks that was the tiebreaker that put Dobbs at the top of the wide receivers this week for me.
Yep, makes sense. And yeah, I do see that we have a lot of questions, but we'll get to them here as they make sense. So don't worry. Um, let's go to the next name on the list. It's Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. So unfortunately, the injury Grim Reaper has claimed another victim this season and another one of our highly drafted fantasy assets. Brandon Ayuk officially done for the year with a torn ACL and MCL. Meanwhile, Deebo Samuel has been hospitalized with pneumonia. So just a disaster right now for the 49ers receivers. Naturally, that means that there's going to be other options that'll need to step up. And we've seen Juwan Jennings step up in games already this season, but they also got back their first-round pick, Ricky Pearsall, after recovering from gunshot wounds. So, Nate, both of these guys make the waiver targets this week for you.
Yeah, Jennings is at the top of my list among the two wide receivers. He is available in just over 50% of ESPN leagues after a number of people dropped him after the last few weeks. Jennings is dealing with an injury himself, so there is a chance he doesn't play this week. The good news is he hasn't gone on injured reserve, so at least we're expecting him back in the near future. So I think Jennings should step into that number 2 wide receiver role. It's hard to know exactly what the 49ers will do just because Ayuk was the clear X receiver. His usage was very distinct from all the other wide receivers on the team. Would not be surprised if they are largely changing how their offense operates without Ayuk on the field, considering how important he was to the team. So I expect Jennings to be the number 2 wide receiver. I don't think that's a guaranteed thing. And then, like you said, Ricky Pearsall, it was good to see him play the slot in this game with Jennings out. And then once injuries started happening, he did become more of an every down receiver. So it was good to see they do trust him on the outside in 2 wide receiver sets. So there is a chance that he does become the number 2 receiver. He was a highly talented wide receiver out of college. Certainly time for his role to expand in the offense. He's a bit more of an unknown of what he'll do. Certainly a chance he remains just the 3rd wide receiver in an offense that has a lot of talented players, but there is also a chance that he becomes one of the top weapons in the offense and a potential top 20 wide receiver over the rest of the season. So wide range of possibilities, but definitely willing to pick him up just to see what happens over these next couple weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, again, first round pick, but available in 95% of leagues essentially here for ESPN. So there's worth a shot for Ricky Pearsall, especially considering the injuries for the 49ers. But speaking of players who were at least expected to step up due to injuries, Juju Smith-Schuster got his rostership up to 46%. Looked even like a strong starting option last week, but unfortunately suffered a hamstring injury that kept him from contributing really anything this past week. But if healthy, we're still thinking he'll be the Chiefs' top wide receiver, Nate.
Yeah, it's going back to the week where he had 130 yards, and then since then they had the bye week and now the injury. He was showing up on the injury report heading into the week and then seemed to re-aggravate the injury. It already sounds like he's not going to be playing this upcoming week, which isn't great to hear. At least he's not going on injured reserve, so hopefully he is back sooner rather than later, in which case I do expect him to be the top wide receiver with one of the best quarterbacks in the league, which is why I still want him on the roster. Just know if you are picking him up, it is for the longer term, not the shorter term. But like you said at the start of the show, there are no bye weeks this week, so hopefully you aren't using the waiver wire to fill someone's starting spot this week. You can hopefully pick up players that are more long-term options for your team.
Yep. Okay. Next up is a trio of wide receivers for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers who, I mean, these guys are going to need to step up because, of course, we couldn't get out of Monday Night Football without more major injuries to top fantasy assets. So both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin suffered injuries last night. Godwin obviously out for the year with the dislocated ankle, and Evans likely to miss some time with his hamstring injury. So Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard, and Trey Palmer are the replacement options in Tampa right now. How are we feeling about these guys going forward?
Sure. So first off, how they use their wide receivers this week. Trey Palmer was the clear backup to Mike Evans. Once Evans went down with the injury, Palmer became that X receiver. He's been the backup X throughout the season, the player who lines up on the line of scrimmage, on the outside, in 2 or 3 wide receiver sets. So Palmer had that kind of Evans had that distinct role in the offense, and Palmer had that distinct role as the backup. I think Palmer will be the starter for however long Mike Evans is out. So fine picking up Palmer as a player, especially for the short term, just depending on how long Evans is out for. As for the other wide receivers, Jalen McMillan was the third wide receiver for most of the season and then dealt with an injury. Sterling Shepard played well in his absence. Last week, we saw Shepard as the number 3 wide receiver for most of the game, with Jalen McMillan kind of eased back into action. This week, it was Jalen McMillan starting as the third receiver, Shepard mixing in, and it was not an even split, one where McMillan had the lead over Shepard. But then we had the injury happen, and the big question at this point is who's going to play in the slot for Tampa Bay. This has been a very important role in the offense this year, and with the coaching staff, it's been an important role in the offense at their past locations with the Rams. So it will be really interesting to see who plays in the slot going forward. A lot of people are expecting it to be Jalen McMillan. That's a role he played in college. We thought he was going to be a slot-only guy coming into the league. But Sterling Shepard also has a pretty extensive history playing in the slot with the New York Giants, played both slot and outside with the team. And once the injury happened, it was Sterling Shepard taking those slot snaps over the last 2 minutes or 1 minute of this game. So I don't know for sure who will be playing in the slot going forward. Because of that, I'm fine picking up both players. McMillan obviously has the most upside of the two, just because he is a young rookie who has played well, and his opportunities so far this year could end up being a great player. But if they decide to leave Shepard in the slot, then there's a chance Shepard could have a lot of receptions going forward. And even though his upside won't be the same, Chris Godwin was the number 2 wide receiver in fantasy these first 7 weeks. So Shepard stepping into that role, neither one of these guys are going to be as good as Godwin, but Shepard could still have a pretty decent season if that's how Tampa Bay decides to handle the situation.
Yeah. I'm with you. I mean, Baker Mayfield's still playing really well here. And obviously, it helps to have those 2 top wide receivers. So we'll see how things kind of look without them. Hopefully Mike Evans gets back at some point, but yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I think Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard, those guys make sense right now, to kind of step up into a larger role and hopefully have some fantasy relevancy. But next wide receiver that we have on the list here is Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys, who obviously on a bye week this past week, but with Brandon Cooks on IR, Tolbert has been operating as the wide receiver 2 in this offense, available in 73% of ESPN leagues, Nate.
Yeah, like you said, at the bye week, so nothing has changed. He is the clear number 2 wide receiver, especially while Brandon Cooks is out, but he could remain the number 2 guy even once Cooks is back. He was playing better than Cooks before the injury, so that's been good to see. From week 2 to week 6, he was a top 36 fantasy wide receiver, so could very well see him in that same kind of role. I think the Cowboys can support 2 fantasy relevant wide receivers plus their tight end, Jake Ferguson. So I think Tolbert not going to be a top 20 wide receiver. He most likely won't be a top 20 wide receiver, but he definitely can be that wide receiver 3 on your team in the right matchup in a number of weeks going forward.
Yep, makes sense. And then how about another promising young wide receiver, a rookie out of Buffalo, Keon Coleman, who just had the best receiving game of his career by putting up 125 yards on just 4 catches, rostered in 44.5% of ESPN leagues. So that waiver wire window is closing quickly, Nate.
Yeah, so they did just trade for Amari Cooper. Cooper this week did not see a huge amount of playing time. They did drop Marquez Valdes-Scantling from the roster, and Cooper basically just took those snaps that Valdes-Scantling was playing. So we really didn't see much change for the Bills wide receivers this week outside of Curtis Samuel also suffered an injury. So Khalil Shakir ended up seeing a higher percentage of snaps in those 3 wide receiver sets. But Keon Coleman's playing time really wasn't affected this week by Amari Cooper. This was just Coleman playing his best game of the season. So even though Cooper will see more playing time going forward, that will probably mostly come at the expense of Matt Collins, but it could come at the expense of Keon Coleman as well. So there is a pretty big danger of picking up Coleman that he could lose playing time, even though he just had this really good game. But it's a case where it's a rookie wide receiver who had a good game, and it's early in the season, and he has Josh Allen at quarterback. So even though the Bills have plenty of other weapons, there's a chance that this is the start of Keon Coleman playing well, in which case he will command more targets going forward.
And then actually another player from Monday Night Football was Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals. Didn't do much in this game, but nobody really did. I think he had just the one catch for 15 yards, but we still like Michael Wilson a fair bit here. I know Greg Dortch scored the touchdown, but Greg Dortch not necessarily playing as much here. So how are you feeling about Michael Wilson going forward?
Yeah, for me, it's been true for the past couple weeks. I will like him a lot better once the Cardinals offense starts playing better. They showed some pretty big sparks early in the season, but we haven't seen those carry out these past few weeks. I think if the Cardinals offense starts playing a lot better, then Wilson will also start playing a lot better. He's been the clear number 2 wide receiver. And the one piece of good news for him this week is Zay Jones returned from his suspension, also missed another week due to injury. So Zay Jones made his debut with the team this week, but he only was playing in 3 wide receiver sets, taking time away from Greg Dortch. So even though Dortch is the one that scored the touchdown, he saw fewer snaps this week. And the interesting thing there is Zay Jones, they were using him just on the outside, where Greg had been a slot receiver. So this meant more playing time for Wilson in the slot, more time for Harrison Jr. in the slot, which could lead to more fantasy production by both of these wide receivers going forward.
Gotcha. So then we got a couple of deeper options here, Nate, before we get into maybe some of the questions about wide receivers, but guys that are rostered in fewer than 1% of ESPN leagues right now. We'll start with Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns, whose playing time rose with the trade of Amari Cooper. How are things looking for Tillman right now for the Browns, Nate?
At least his playing time's looking good. He was a clear number 4 wide receiver prior to the trade, was constantly on the field, whoever was off the field. So Tillman both saw a lot more playing time in 11 personnel, also some time in 2 wide receiver sets as well, which was good to see. But then he was the clear lead wide receiver on the team in terms of targets, receptions, saw 12 targets, caught 8 passes for 81 yards. So David Njoku should be the top receiving option in general on the team, but Tillman could be the other wide receiver who's playing well. They do have Jerry Jeudy. They do have Elijah Moore. Would not be at all surprised if one of those 2 other wide receivers does step up rather than Tillman. And it also could depend on just who's the quarterback going forward and who the quarterback prefers. So I think there is a range of possibilities of what could happen with Cleveland, but Tillman is a young player who was drafted decently high and stepped up when he had the opportunity this week. So there's a chance he continues to step up in this role. And there's definitely an opening for a top wide receiver in Cleveland.
Yeah, definitely an opening there. So final wide receiver on the list. And I just want to say how much I appreciate you saving the best for last, Nate, because all Troy Franklin did was lead the Broncos in targets, receptions, and receiving yards on Thursday Night Football in prime time. Should have had a touchdown as well. Bo Nix with the weirdest throw of the week, where he missed 2 wide open wide receivers, and Franklin was the deep man in that situation. So, Nate, can we get the Troy Franklin rostership numbers up now?
Hopefully, he did have the 5 catches for 50 yards, so good to see out of him. Second straight week where he has put up some decent numbers, and especially since Josh Reynolds has landed on injured reserve, Troy Franklin has been one of those clear top 3 receivers. It's Franklin and Devon Bailey, who's often been on the field in 3 wide receiver sets, and then Lil Jordan Humphrey is still seeing significant playing time, cutting into the playing time of both Franklin and Bailey, but it's mostly been in 2 wide receiver sets and clear run situations. So Franklin still has a pretty decent route percentage. And I think the big thing to note here is Courtland Sutton hasn't done a whole lot this season, did not see a target in the game. So there's a chance that Franklin can not only just be one of the top 2 or 3 receivers in Denver, I think there's at least an opportunity for him to be the top receiving option. And this is also a team that doesn't really target their tight ends very often, does throw to the running backs sometimes, but didn't do it too much in this past game. So Franklin has a chance to see a significantly increased role in the offense going forward.
Love it. Hopefully we see that. But yeah, it'll depend on that offense here. But okay, let's quickly hit on a couple of these questions, if that's all right, Nate. We got a few here. Let me see. We got Trey Parker. I think that means Trey Palmer. That's not a question. Trey Parker of South Park fame, obviously. We got a question. Thoughts on Batman. No, that's probably Rashad Bateman. I love Batman,
Bateman,
probably
yeah.
my favorite superhero. But here's the correct spelling. Thoughts on Rashad Bateman? Has had a couple nice games here, Nate. I don't, he didn't make the waiver wire list. I'm assuming his rostership up over 50%, if I remember correctly. But actually, I'm not 100%. Do you know what his
Yeah,
numbers were?
he's probably available in a decent number of leagues.
Yeah.
Part of this was just it was Monday Night Football, but also he has only caught at most 4 passes in a game. So even though he's made the big plays in recent weeks and a touchdown in 3 of the last 5 games, the fact that he's only getting a couple of targets each week has me a little bit concerned. And the Ravens offense in general, we see how well they were running the ball and they just dominated a very good football team. They're going to be able to dominate most football teams going forward, and they have no problem just running the ball over and over. They started this game from behind and had to catch up a little bit, so they were passing the ball a bit more, and then that helped their receivers in general. Mark Andrews also had a good game, but I think for me, it's because the Ravens have too many receiving options. Zay Flowers suffered an injury early in the game. He came back and kept playing throughout the game, but really didn't see any targets, wasn't involved in the offense from that point forward. So I'm fine picking up Bateman in some leagues, but I'd have a hard time putting him in my fantasy lineup or even knowing what weeks I'd be comfortable putting him in my starting lineup. So definitely in deeper leagues, when any wide receiver who has a good week is available, I'd put him on the roster in those leagues. But in some of these lighter leagues, because I can see a path to some of these other young wide receivers becoming a fantasy starter, where I have a hard time seeing that for Bateman in this offense, who isn't going to need to throw a lot, it's harder for me to trust him there.
Yeah, and I really think that the Zay Flowers, I guess it was his ankle or something like that he was dealing with. I think that played a big part in it. He just felt like they were using him more as a decoy there once that happened, and just kind of rotating him in and out to see how he was doing. But yeah, we'll see how that goes going forward. But I'm with you. And then the other one, I guess, since we talked about running backs and wide receivers already, this one has to do with how would you rank these waiver wire ads between Jonathan Brooks of the Carolina Panthers, Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Raheem Mostert of the Dolphins, Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers, Keon Coleman of the Bills, and Dontavian Wicks of the Packers for a flex spot, I guess, this week.
Fair. So probably a flex spot in general because there are a number of injuries here. But I think out of the 3 running backs, Jonathan Brooks, just because there is a chance he becomes the clear starter. I know Hubbard's has played well so far this season, but just because there's that upside chance for Brooks, where I think White probably needs an injury, Mostert needs an injury in order for them to be fantasy starters again. And then at wide receiver, the order that we talked about them in, Jennings and then Coleman, and then Wicks I'd probably have as a clear third. A big reason why Wicks was high on our waiver wire list before is because Christian Watson suffered an injury that we weren't sure how long he'd be out for, but Watson is back now. The two are back to splitting the snaps pretty close to 50-50, so Wicks just isn't seeing the field enough to be a fantasy starter, and I don't see him earning enough of those snaps because Romeo Doubs is playing well, because Jaden Reed is playing well. It would take Christian Watson basically rarely seeing the field, and I don't think that's going to happen. So Wicks a clear third among those wide receivers for me.
Yeah, and if I learned anything from Dontavian Wicks, it's as soon as you trust him, you can't trust him, and then as soon as you give up on him is when he scores a touchdown. So, no, I'm sure it'll be fine. But yeah, I'm with you. I like those rankings there as well. We'll see what happens with Jonathan Brooks. That should be an interesting situation to keep an eye on in Carolina too once he gets on the field. I think that was all the wide receiver and running back related questions here.
I believe
Looks
so,
like
yeah.
it. Yeah. So let's go on to a quick ad break, and then we'll get into the tight ends. I want to let you know that this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Think of a time recently when you didn't feel like you could be your future self, like you were hiding behind a mask. October is the season for wearing masks and costumes, but some of us feel like we wear a mask and hide more often than we want to. At work, in social settings, around our family, therapy can help you learn to accept all parts of yourself so you can take off the mask. Because masks should be for Halloween fun, not for our emotions. Therapy can be really useful to get a better understanding of how your mind actually works and how to become more aware of your own patterns of behavior and how to improve them. It's useful for everybody, not just people struggling with something specific. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a convenient, flexible, and entirely online way to get therapy that's right for you. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Take off the mask with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/PFFfantasy to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/PFFfantasy. All right, let's talk about some. Okay. We got a couple more wide receiver questions. What was your thoughts on Ridley was a waiver wire ad? I mean, I think we talked about Calvin Ridley last week, right? And somebody asked, I had a very similar question. Would you add Calvin Ridley where you could? And just hasn't been doing anything in this Titans offense. Any change for you for Calvin Ridley and what he can do for fantasy purposes?
Yeah, actually, I dug into him a little bit more because I did include him as a player to buy low in my article as well. The Titans' schedule has been very interesting in that they've played a ton of very difficult opponents early in the season. I think all three of the top teams at preventing fantasy points to wide receivers, and the schedule takes a complete 180, is very nice for them over the rest of the season. We'll talk about Will Levis again once we get to quarterbacks like we do every week, but the schedule is even nicer for wide receivers. So Ridley has been among the top wide receivers in terms of targets over the past 2 weeks. So they're trying to get him the ball, but it's been with Will Levis, who was dealing with an injury, and then Mason Rudolph. So not the most accurate targets thrown his way at times. And then he's also dropped 2 passes. And we know that drops in the past aren't necessarily an indicator for drops in the future. So I think going forward, Ridley will continue to have the targets against much better or much nicer opponents for him, and he shouldn't have those drops continue. So I think Ridley does have the opportunity to have a lot better second half of the season. So he's probably the top player that I'd consider in terms of targeting in a trade right now. But if he is available on the waiver wire, I think he's available only in about a quarter of ESPN leagues right now. But if he's available in your league, I would definitely look to pick him up.
Okay, there you go. And then other one here was, do we drop Chris Olave for Jawan Jennings? I know, Chris Olave was dealing with the concussion heading into Thursday Night Football, should be back for this week, but I know the offense and stuff has probably got people concerned as well. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I would. I think the injuries have been a big problem for the Saints. I think they will get a number of their players back, including Derek Carr. And then Rashid Shaheed going on injury reserve probably means that Olave is going to be the clear target earner going forward. A lot of those targets had been split between the 2 wide receivers, but now Olave is back to being the clear top receiving option in the offense. So I would probably still hold on to Olave, where Jennings, even though he had that really good game and should be the number 2 wide receiver, they still have Deebo Samuel. They still have George Kittle. They still value their running back position. At some point, Christian McCaffrey could be returning as well. So Olave is still the top option in that offense, where Jennings could only be the 4th option.
Gotcha. Okay, one more before we go to the tight ends. Does Jalen Waddle's value improve going forward? And do you think Devontae Smith can be more reliable than what we saw this week? I know it's been a frustrating ride here with Jalen Waddle and even Tyreek Hill. But Tua should be back. Hopefully that helps Waddle. What do you think about Devontae Smith as well?
Oh, yeah, I agree. I think having Tua back in the offense is going to be night and day with how this offense has looked versus how it will look. Hopefully that helps Waddle. Hopefully it helps Tyreek Hill as well. So would not be giving up on either of those wide receivers. And then Devontae Smith, I know he hasn't had the greatest weeks, but the Eagles have just been winning, and A.J. Brown has had a huge target share. Would not be surprised if that balances out a little bit more, and some of those targets that have been going to Brown start going to Smith again. And the Eagles will probably also face some more difficult opponents, which means they'll have to be passing the ball a bit more. So also not giving up on Smith yet.
Nice. All right. And then we got other questions, but we'll save them for when we get to the quarterbacks and stuff, because they are a little bit quarterback related. We'll move on to the tight ends now. So I think we've had the Troy Franklin graphic up here long enough for people to enjoy. And we'll talk about the tight ends. And our familiar friend, Taysom Hill, continues to wait for clearance to get back on the field. And maybe then we'll see him join a few more fantasy rosters.
Yeah, I feel bad for including him as the top tight end each week, and then he just keeps remaining out with injury. But at least we had Romeo Dobbs, who we had as the number one wide receiver, and it took a few weeks for him to pay off, and now he's finally paying off. So hopefully the same thing happens for Hill. It's just when he has been healthy in those very limited times this season, he's been playing even more than he was playing in past years. And now with the injury to Rashid Shaheed as well, Hill could be even more involved in the passing game going forward than he had been in the past. So I think Hill is going to be a player that's going to be heavily involved in the offense once he's healthy. And it does sound like he's taken some positive steps forward. I believe this past week he was limited in practice rather than not practicing. And it sounds like he should be practicing even more this week. So hopefully this is the week where Hill is back on the field. Probably won't be starting Hill this week just to see. I wouldn't be surprised if they ease him back into action after he's been out so long. But I think we do get to a point where Hill is seeing a lot of carries and some targets each week, which is something you don't see out of any other tight end.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then Kate Otten also on the list. I know we had a question about him, about being, someone to start over like a Jake Ferguson, but Kate he's definitely out there in just over 50% of ESPN leagues right now. Played on Monday Night Football last night as well. How are we feeling about Kate Otten as a starting tight end option going forward?
I think it's pretty fair to call him a fantasy starter at this point. He's definitely at that borderline, and it could depend on the opponent a little bit here and there. But even before Monday Night Football, when I was ranking all these players, I still had Otten number 2 on this list before everything that happened last night, just because he is a young tight end who has been playing his best football in these last couple of weeks, has been targeted more the past couple of weeks than he had been at any other point in his career. And then last night, he caught the 8 passes for 100 yards. And now that Chris Godwin is likely out for the season, that means more of those inside targets. A lot of them will probably go to one of the wide receivers, but that could lead to an even bigger target share for Otten going forward. So considering his playing time is better than any other tight end, very consistently playing either 100% of snaps or only taking a couple plays off here and there. That's the best situation in terms of routes run for a tight end, in terms of offensive snaps for a tight end. The Buccaneers do like throwing the ball a lot, which helps as well. So he doesn't even need to be one of the more talented tight ends to be a fantasy starter. But if he starts playing better and plays better in these opportunities, then he can definitely be a top 10 fantasy tight end going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that he's going to see, a pretty good amount of targets there with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin out. Could be, a favorite target there of Baker Mayfield as well. But speaking of potential favorite targets, maybe one of Drake May's favorite receiving options right now got a touchdown in week 6. It's Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots, rostered in 27% of ESPN leagues, led the team in targets, receptions, and receiving yards in week 7. I think he's like a top 5 PPR tight end on the season, and still, like I said, rostered in just 27% of ESPN leagues, Nate. So Hunter Henry has to be on the waiver target list.
Yeah, he is probably the most frustrating fantasy tight end over these past couple of seasons, because if you look at his best games, they look very much the same as any other tight end that you drafted early. His best games, he gets a ton of catches for a ton of yards. Don't think he scored the touchdown this week, but has in past weeks. So in terms of how often he has an excellent week, he is right up there with all the other tight ends. The only problem is the number of times he has a bad week is so much higher than the other tight ends that you have as your fantasy starters. Typically someone like a Travis Kelce, hopefully he has those big games with 8 catches, almost 100 yards. But when he has a bad game, he's at least catching a couple of passes for a decent number of yards. So he's not having this huge hole in your roster as often, where Henry is very consistently outside of the top 18 fantasy tight ends, not just the top 12 fantasy tight ends. So a lot of times he's just catching 2 or 3 passes. And that's what's happened over these past 2 years. We saw Henry have those couple of big games early in the season and then not again throughout the season. This year, Henry has had 2 big games, but then outside of those 2 big games, he hasn't done much. So those 2 big games add up to a lot. But those other weeks, if you put him in your fantasy lineup, you're either getting that huge game or he's potentially hurting your team's chances of winning.
Yeah, gotta love the Hunter Henry experience, but it's a lot of the times the tight end experience overall. But Nate, next up is Noah Fant of the Seattle Seahawks. He's been on this list before, has been solid over the past couple of weeks as well, but 10 catches over his last 2 games, has gone over 60 receiving yards in each of the past 2 as well. I know DK Metcalf also banged up now, so maybe there's a little bigger piece of the pie for Noah Fant to take a bite out of, Nate.
Oh yeah, Fat. Another frustrating tight end. For him, it's more the utilization in that in the past couple years, he's been with the Seahawks team that has had a 3-man rotation at tight end. And at least this year, it's not quite the same, but they are still rotating him out significantly out of 11 personnel. It seemed like he was going in a good direction there of getting more and more of those 11 personnel snaps. And despite his good stats in this game, he took a step back in terms of playing time in 11 personnel, only played in 25 of 46 snaps. They have that rookie, AJ Barner, who they like to get involved and want to get, it seems like they want to get him even more and more involved going forward, which isn't great to see for Fant. And then they have Pharaoh Brown, who's more of a blocking tight end at this point, but he is also taking at least some of those 11 personnel snaps. So Fant has put up good numbers in the past couple weeks. It has come at a time where Jackson Smith and Njigba hasn't been playing quite as much, so wouldn't be surprised if Smith and Njigba starts getting more targets, which would mean fewer targets for Fant, but also a chance that Fant just continues doing what he's doing and maybe earn some of that playing time back.
Yeah, I'm with you. And then next up, Nate, is Jonnu Smith, because I mean, at least someone in Miami's receiving core was doing something, because it sure wasn't Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle. Like we said, Tua is expected back this week. So, those guys will hopefully do better. But what do we like about Jonnu Smith in this Miami offense?
Yeah, you can't have a tight end get 7 receptions for 96 yards and a touchdown and not at least include him on the waiver wire article and podcast. But with Smith, his usage is even more concerning than Noah Fant. Smith not seeing any playing time in 21 personnel, which Miami loves to use. How Alec Ingold, their fullback on the team, and even sometimes having 2 of their halfbacks on the field at the same time. So Smith isn't playing a lot in those situations, is getting rotated out a decent amount of 11 personnel. I think this was his first game playing over 50% of offensive snaps in a game, very consistently under 50%. And it took Tyreek Hill having 1 catch, Jalen Waddle having 1 catch for Smith to have this big of a role in the offense. I think a lot of it just goes back to what we were saying before with Tua. We think Tua coming back will have a huge impact on the offense. If the Dolphins start winning games with Tua, then they'll be running the ball more, be in more run formations. That means Jonnu Smith will not be on the field nearly as much. So definitely a lot of concerns about Smith's playing time, but Smith did perform well this week. It's not the first week that he's performed well as well. He's also had a couple weeks where he really hasn't been involved in the offense. I think in his 3 games that he hasn't performed as well, he has a total of 3 receptions in those 3 games. So Smith, another player where, yeah, you can have a couple of good weeks, but he's going to have just as many bad weeks in your lineup, and they're going to be very bad weeks in your lineup. And it could be more of those games going forward after the Dolphins start playing better and get Hill and Waddle more involved again.
Yeah, so there you go. Probably for deeper leagues there. And then how about Will Dissly of the Los Angeles Chargers, who led all receiving options in that Chargers-Cardinals game on Monday Night Football with 81 yards on 8 receptions. Nate, Will Dissly saw a little bit of an increase in playing time this week.
Yeah, he's an interesting one. This Chargers team in general have been interesting. We thought there was a chance, especially talking about sleeper tight ends at the beginning of the season, that a tight end could emerge out this team. And given the coaching staff, their history with the San Francisco 49ers, with Vernon Davis being one of the top tight ends, and then their offensive coordinator back with their time with the Ravens, when Mark Andrews was a consistent top 5 tight end, that a tight end could be a clear part of this offense. And we saw them sign in free agency, Dissly to a 3-year, $24 million contract, and Hayden Hurst to a 1-year, $1 million-ish contract. So they definitely invested heavily in Dissly, but Dissly has also been one of the top run blocking tight ends in the league. So we knew that a big reason why he got so much money was for his run blocking. But Dissly has consistently gotten 200 to 300 receiving yards each season, was part of that 3-man rotation in Seattle for a long time. And before Seattle had that 3-man rotation with Shane Waldron, Dissly did have some decent games and decent seasons as a receiving tight end there. Over the first 5 weeks of the season, it had been Hayden Hurst as the clear receiving tight end, but despite that, Hurst only had one more target than Disley, and Disley had more receiving yards. So even though Hayden Hurst had been the receiving tight end, Disley was being more productive as a tight end. And now Hayden Hurst dealing with an injury that allowed Disley to step up in playing time both of these past 2 weeks. And with that, he caught 8 passes for 81 yards. So Disley had more receiving production in this game than Hayden Hurst has had all season long. So certainly a chance once Hurst is healthy again that Hurst is back to being the receiving tight end, in which case Disley would have no fantasy value. But there is also a chance that Disley, after this very productive game, remains a receiving tight end. And given the offensive coordinator and head coach's history with tight ends, there's a chance that Disley could be the top receiver in the Chargers offense for the rest of the season. So that's why Disley is on this list, is even though I don't think it's the most likely scenario where he ends up as the top receiver on the team going forward, I do think there's a chance. And if that does happen, there is a pretty clear path to being a top 12 tight end just from target volume alone.
There you go. Good stuff. And then, Nate, you have an interesting name here listed next. One of the Kansas City Chiefs tight ends, and no, not Taylor Swift's boyfriend, obviously, but Noah Gray. What did you see from Noah Gray's usage to get him in the mix this week?
Yeah, so the big thing here is first the Rashee Rice injury and now the Juju Smith-Schuster injury. Once Smith-Schuster went down, even though they had some of the backup wide receivers start to see more playing time, they also just started using more 2 tight end sets. So Noah Gray was on the field more last week or more 2 weeks ago, but as well, even more so this past week, he was playing more often. They were playing 12 personnel 40% of the time. Gray is also on the field at times when Travis Kelce is off the field, and Gray had a very productive game. He is someone who has been consistently seeing at least some catches each week. If you were in a league where you had to start 2 tight ends, Gray would be someone that had been fantasy relevant. But Gray has a chance, at least in the short term, with Juju Smith-Schuster likely out at least 1 week, but could also be out for longer. Gray could be fantasy relevant, and he is available in over 99% of leagues. Didn't quite realize that, well, Disley would also be someone I'd be talking about that's available in 99% of leagues as well. So Disley probably the better option of the two when I first included Gray on the list, but I do think Gray has a shot at being fantasy relevant in the short term while Smith-Schuster is out.
Fair enough. All right, and then we got another deep rookie option, this time at tight end as well. Jatavion Sanders of the Carolina Panthers, also with a rostership below 1%. Nate, what do we think about Sanders' role in Carolina's offense here going forward?
Yeah, so he caught 6 passes for 61 yards. The rest of the players on the team combined for like 20-something yards, 28 yards. So Sanders, the clear top Panthers receiving option this week. The big thing here is Tommy Trumbull, one of their tight ends from the past couple of years. When he was healthy this season, that is why Sanders had that huge drop in snaps in week 3 and week 4. Trumbull's been out the past couple of weeks, which is why Sanders jumped back up to around 75% of offensive snaps. I think once Trumbull's back, this could be an ugly 3-man rotation because Ian Thomas also been healthy recently, more of a run blocking tight end, but still definitely involved in the offense. The ideal thing would be Sanders keeps this role, given that he's the young rookie who just had his best game of his career. I don't think there's 100% that chance that happens, but if it does and Sanders remains the top tight end, there's certainly a chance that he becomes fantasy relevant this season. But it'll be interesting to see what they do once Tommy Trumbull's back.
For sure. All right, let's go on to some quarterbacks now. And we were talking about Sam Darnold in the first few weeks of the year, but his rostership had rose and then dropped again, likely because of the team having a bye week. But he's back now and had another nice game against the Lions in week 7, available in about 55% of ESPN leagues right now, Nate.
Oh, yeah, this is the weekly. There's a guy who's available in just over 50% of the leagues who just had the bye week, which is probably why his rostership percentage got low and then it didn't quite pick up again. With Darnold in particular, he had those first 4 very good weeks and then played the New York Jets, didn't have a good week in week 5. So I think that also probably contributed to people dropping him, as him having that bad game, but he's not going to play the New York Jets again. The Jets having one of the clear top pass secondaries this season, both in terms of PFF grade as well as not allowing fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. Darnold played the Lions this week, had a decent game, 259 yards, threw it for a touchdown, also ran the ball a couple of times, 4 times for 39 yards. So probably not going to face the Lions. We'll face the Lions again, but the opponents won't always be quite as difficult as they have been recently. And when he did face easier opponents, he was a top 4 fantasy quarterback. So I think someone definitely needs to be on fantasy rosters and someone who can be in starting lineups a lot of weeks, just depending on the matchup.
Yeah, no, for sure. And then we talked about Tua just briefly. He's up next again, rostered in just 26.5% of ESPN leagues, but because he was dropped due to his stint on IR. Again, it appears that he'll be back in week 8 against Arizona. Sounds like he won't be wearing the Guardian cap for some reason. Who knows? But we like a healthy Tua, Nate. That's the main thing here for sure.
Yep, we've talked about him for a couple weeks now, just because he was a top 10 quarterback in fantasy last year. He was top 10 in week 1. So he has been a top 10 quarterback when he's been healthy. And ideally, he's back to 100% when he starts playing again. So he's another player that I think can definitely be in fantasy starting lineups in the right matchups going forward.
Nice. And how about rookie quarterback Drake May, who has been an effective fantasy starter since he's been the Patriots starter, Nate? I know I had picked him up in a league, about 20 points or so, at least over 20 points in the last couple of games. So he's looked pretty good. Do you feel like Drake May is a sustainable option here going forward?
I think he's someone that I would at least be comfortable picking him up and seeing what happens going forward. Even though he has been putting up a lot of stats, his PFF grade hasn't quite been as high as we would like to see so far. A big part of his fantasy production has also simply been passing touchdowns. I don't think his touchdown rate will be very sustainable, but I would also expect rookie quarterbacks to start playing better after their first 2 starts as well. So a chance that he starts playing better going forward to help make up for that lower touchdown total. Touchdowns are a huge part of fantasy, though, so he really does need those. But it's been 2 games. He's looked very good in those 2 games in terms of fantasy production. So I at least want him on my roster just to see what happens going forward. But the schedule has been favorable in the first 2 starts. It is worth noting that his next 3 games, Jets, Titans, and Bears, who are the 3rd, 12th, and 2nd team respectively at preventing fantasy points to quarterbacks. So I expect May to have a pretty significant drop-off in these next 3 games. I'd be fine picking him up now, just to hold on to him for later in the season. But just depending on your league, I could very well see him getting dropped from a number of teams over these next 3 weeks. So you might be fine just leaving him on the waiver wire and then picking him up in a couple weeks from now. Just, you have to know your league mates. You have to know their habits in terms of how they pick up players. And because of that, you might be able to get away with leaving him on the waiver wire.
Makes sense. All right. So Jameis Winston makes his debut on the waiver target list, Nate, thanks to a Deshaun Watson Achilles injury. And I guess thanks to a potential Dorian Thompson-Robinson hand injury as well. It's got to be Jameis steering the ship going forward, right?
We would hope so. I think the big thing is Cleveland is looking to the future. So this week, there was a pretty light week in terms of surprise inactives for the early slate of games. The one surprise inactive was Jameis Winston. When I update rankings and that kind of stuff, that was the one player where I'm like, okay, I have to make an adjustment off of the inactives, because they did make Thomas Robinson the number 2 quarterback for this game. It seems like the philosophy before was they have to keep playing Watson because of his contract, and they wanted Thompson Robinson as the number 2 because right now they are playing for the future more so than this year, in which case there is a chance Thompson Robinson could be the quarterback of the future, or Jameis Winston at 30 years old, probably not the future of the position for the Cleveland Browns, but Thompson Robinson did suffer the injury, and Winston just went in and scored a touchdown after Thompson Robinson threw the interceptions in the game. So you would hope Winston is the quarterback, in which case, if that happens, Winston has looked fairly decent given his opportunities, was a top 15 quarterback in his 3 starts in 2022, was top 21 in his 7 starts in 2021, and was the quarterback 3 overall in 2019. And all of those different teams, different situations a number of years ago. But Winston, I think there's at least a chance, considering his style of play, could be a fantasy relevant quarterback in Cleveland, a team that will probably need to pass the ball a lot. But if Thompson Robinson is the starter, last year he was quarterback 25, quarterback 28, quarterback 32 in his finishes. So, of course, super flex leagues, whenever we're talking about quarterbacks off the waiver wire, primarily talking about single quarterback leagues, because anyone who is a starter or a chance of starting is a waiver wire target in super flex leagues, but would not be looking for Thompson Robinson in single quarterback leagues if he does end up being the starter.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. So yeah, maybe we get some Jameis. Hopefully, I feel like they left him as an inactive to avoid the "we want Jameis" chants from the home crowd there, but we'll see. And then lastly, before we get into some of the questions here, we talked about Will Levis and his favorable schedule down the stretch. He remains an option here heading into Week 8.
Yeah, the weekly Levis spot. He's been injured, so we haven't even been able to update how well he has been playing. But like I mentioned before, a very tough schedule early in the season. Recently has been dealing with injuries. From week 12 to week 17, he faces the Jaguars twice, the Colts, the Commanders, the Texans, the Bengals. All of those matchups are teams that are in the top 11 at allowing fantasy points to quarterbacks. So all teams who have struggled against quarterbacks so far this season, where early in the season he had very tough matchups. So I think Levis, if he's healthy, he should be playing better, should especially be playing better against these opponents. Hopefully he is just playing better in general. Obviously his PFF grade not very high so far this season, but a lot of things need to go right. But if they do go right, it is the perfect mix. The Titans have the clear top schedule for the passing game over the last third of the season.
Gotcha. All right. So a couple questions here that we got. This one from Richard Bug, who asks, someone dropped Dak Prescott last week. He's torn between picking up him or Tua Tagovailoa. Do you have a favorite for rest of season here between Dak or Tua, Nate?
Probably leaning Prescott a little bit, but I think it's only a slight lean towards him.
Makes sense. Yeah. Both guys got really good options. But rest of season schedule here. Well, I think Dak could be the better option. Probably the safer option too, especially if Tua's not going to wear that Guardian cap. But how about I know we had another quarterback question here. Oh, is Mariota a legit replacement option for Jaden Daniels? So I know Jaden Daniels dealing with the ribs injury. Mariota came in, looked pretty good. They won that game pretty easily against Carolina. So how are you feeling about Mariota if Jaden Daniels can't go this week?
Yeah, I think specifically if Daniels can't go, I think Mariota can definitely be an option if you're looking for someone specifically this week. Did not include him on the list because things have sounded pretty positive for Daniels. And because this is a week where there are no bye weeks, hopefully most teams aren't going to be scrambling too much for a quarterback specifically for this week. But if you are a team that did have Daniels, did not have a suitable backup option on your roster, then I think Mariota is definitely a viable option specifically for this upcoming week.
Yeah, I know they're facing the Bears this week as well, and like you had mentioned earlier, the Bears have been a tougher matchup for quarterbacks as well, so something to keep in mind there. But Nate will have the rankings out today, right? Or yeah, so yep. You could always check that as well to see who your other options are. I think there was one more that I want. Oh, no. That was the Dak or Tua one. Oh yeah, there was the defense and special teams question. Any idea for like a bid amount for the Chiefs defense and special team, mentioning that they have a good matchup here for the next 3 weeks? I don't know if you're thinking about like maybe fab percentage here. How much would you typically spend on like a defense or special teams to pick up for the next 3 weeks, Nate? Any idea there?
I'm generally not bidding too much on a defense just because the defense, so much of it is dependent on the offense. It's been years since I looked at this, but I know when I did look at it, the quality of the defense each week. It depended more on the offense they were facing than the quality of the defense themselves. So I've always been a fan of streaming defenses in the leagues where I can stream defenses, which is most leagues. And the leagues where I'm not able to stream defenses, then I'm just stuck with whoever's on my roster because all the defenses are taken. So I probably wouldn't put too much into it, and I'd be fine just picking up a defense with whoever you can get for not spending any money each week, so you can save that money for cases like this where we have clear wide receiver injuries, so we have someone who's going to be a clear starter over the rest of the season. I would much rather have one of those players than picking up a different defense.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think that's it. Unless the Jets are going to break any more news for us, like they have the past 2 weeks in a row. Anything from the Jets this week? Do you see anything come through?
I'm not seeing anything. Just something about DJ Humphries, and that's an offensive lineman. And
Okay.
yeah, don't need to cover that piece.
All right, there we go. So that is going to do it for us. Thank you all for tuning in and for the questions. Hopefully that helps with your waiver wire targets this week, and help to deal with a lot of the injuries as well. Nate, thank you for putting this huge list together as always, and doing the heavy lifting here. And before you go, please remind everyone what you have going on at pff.com this week.
Sure. So as always, have the recaps to all the games up, the top 10 recap as well. Waiver wire article if you want to read about any of the players that we talked about today. Rest of season rankings are up on the website. 5 to add, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high, 5 to drop. Really looked at the schedules going forward and based a lot of my buy low and sell high players on the schedule going forward. So I think some interesting notes there. And also, we're only a couple weeks away from most fantasy leagues having their trade deadline. So only a couple more weeks of that article going forward. After that, we'll have my rankings up later today, like we mentioned, hopefully within the next couple of hours. We'll have that up on the website. And then we'll have start sit up on Thursday.
Nice. Yeah, looking forward to that. And then as for me, I'll have the IDP fantasy report out shortly today, followed by the wide receiver man zone coverage report will be out on Thursday. IDP rankings will be out as well on the website by Wednesday, and O-line, D-line matchups to target and avoid as well. And then back in the podcast feed doing the Week 8 IDP preview, as well as the Week 8 Start Sit show with Nick Bodiford. So make sure to check those out as well. And until next time, peace out.